The first time I encountered the photographs, nothing about them felt extraordinary. They came from municipal archives and private collections, dated neatly in fading ink to the late 1880s. Bridge crews, river crossings, steel trusses suspended over slow-moving water, the kinds of images historians flit past without comment. I lingered. Men stood along the framework in rolled sleeves and dark work coats, their faces fixed in that tired, neutral expression common to long exposures. Nothing theatrical. No banners. No stage display. Just labor paused for a lens. Yet the machinery behind them resisted quick dismissal. Winch housings rose to chest height. Gear assemblies dwarfed shoulders. Handrails sat far above, where a resting palm should. Naturally full, I began measuring. Door frames at the maintenance sheds exceeded ordinary proportions. Counterweights hung lower than expected, thicker than any ergonomic design demanded. The surrounding terrain remained mundane. Dirt embankments, timber scaffolding, horse carts waiting off to the side. Only the hardware strained against the scale of the people beside it. Engineers appear in ledger margins, laborers in payroll lists, archivists in stamped accession cards. Their records preserve tonnage, rivet counts, replacement intervals. None mentioned height. That silence unsettled me more than exaggeration would have. When I placed the dates side by side, another detail surfaced. These images did not scatter across centuries. They clustered tightly within a narrow band of years. A decade, then fewer, then none at all. I did not know what it meant yet, only that the pattern had begun. The next set of photographs arrived from different continents, yet they spoke in the same proportions. Rail crossings in Eastern Europe, canal locks along colonial trade routes, suspension bridges photographed from muddy embankments in South America. Each image carried its own archive stamp, its own handwritten catalog number, its own municipal seal. Nothing suggested a coordinated collection. The geography refused to cooperate with coincidence. I started tracing components instead of locations. Pulley housings rose to the same relative height across decades and borders. Truss members followed identical ratios between span and thickness. Maintenance walkways floated above head level, forcing ordinary workers to crane their necks in some images while standing comfortably upright in others. Survey maps preserved load tolerances. Shipping registries recorded counterweight mass. Municipal clerks itemized replacement chains and lubrication schedules down to the ounce. Not a single ledger bothered to annotate the bodies operating the machines. That omission grew louder with repetition. The more examples I added, the less defensible randomness became. Different rivers, different governments, different engineers trained in separate traditions. The same dimensional logic persisted, and yet, when I searched for the people, the trail thinned. The steel remains in place today, restored and repainted, converted into heritage sites or pedestrian crossings. Tourist brochures celebrate industrial triumph. Historical plaques recite construction dates. They do not mention who once stood comfortably beneath rails that now loom overhead. That imbalance lingered. Equipment endured, operators vanished. The gap between those two facts widened with every archive I opened. The paper trail did not deny what I was seeing. It simply refused to discuss it. Catalog cards acknowledged oversized gear assemblies without comment. Museum inventories listed maintenance components under neutral headings. Engineering reports recorded tolerances, corrosion rates, structural fatigue. Everything necessary to preserve the machines survived. Nothing addressed the bodies that once stood among them. Language did the work quietly, decorative, ceremonial, overbuilt. Each word closed a door without appearing to. Committees signed off on reclassifications, departments merged collections, curators shifted artifacts into storage rooms where public displays rarely wandered. The decisions looked administrative, procedural, forgettable in isolation. Only when aligned across institutions did they begin to resemble something heavier. Acquisition logs thinned after certain years, accession numbers skipped, Donor records vanished between editions of printed catalogs. Equipment that had once warranted full descriptions was reduced to a single line item, stripped of context. Stripped of inquiry. I searched for objections. There were none. No marginal notes questioning scale. No internal memoranda flagging biological anomalies. No correspondence debating ergonomics. The absence felt deliberate, without declaring itself so. Steel endured. Paper contracted. The gap between them widened. And beneath that shrinking archive, a different question waited. If machines were preserved so carefully, what had happened to the people who once operated them? The machines had dominated the record for so long that introducing bodies into the equation felt almost intrusive. I found them in payroll sheets first. Height notations penciled beside names. Clothing requisitions requesting extended coats. Reinforced boots. Gloves cut to uncommon measurements. Tool orders followed the same pattern. Oversized grips, elongated handles, harness straps that exceeded standard issue by entire increments rather than marginal adjustments. Foremen signed the forms. Quartermasters approved them. Census clerks copied the figures into columns that never paused to interpret what they recorded. Nothing in the language suggested spectacle, no margins marked with astonishment, no side notes questioning proportions. Just numbers moving from ledger to ledger with bureaucratic obedience. The effect was more disturbing than exaggeration would have been. These were not newspaper curiosities. They were administrative routines. Human scale had entered the machinery. I traced the entries forward, then watched them stop. After the final decades of the 19th century, the notations vanish. Clothing sizes revert to ordinary ranges. Tool dimensions normalize. Height columns flatten into predictable distributions. The same offices continue filing reports. The same departments maintain bridges and locks. Only the extraordinary measurements disappear. The timing aligns too neatly with the archival thinning I had already seen. Paper retreats, bodies follow, and the systems built for larger hands remain, bolted into riverbanks and stone pylons, waiting for operators who never return. Once I stepped beyond single rivers and isolated rail corridors, the scope widened faster than I expected. Viaducts in alpine valleys, flood control works along delta plains, harbor cranes rising above colonial ports. Each site arrived with its own local context, its own engineering tradition, its own bureaucratic stamp. Yet the proportions repeated with unsettling fidelity. Dredging arms extended to the same relative reach. Stone-cutting rigs followed identical ratios between blade housing and operator platform. Crane cabins perched higher than ergonomic necessity demanded. Balanced on frames thickened beyond what wind loads alone would require. I stopped cataloging places and began cataloging dimensions. The numbers lined up. Correspondence between ministries standardized replacement parts across borders. Railway boards circulated design amendments that mirrored those issued to oceans away. Port authorities approved upgrades using specifications that felt copied rather than invented locally. The paperwork did not acknowledge borrowing, only adoption. No single directive surfaced. No central office announced itself. Coordination existed without fingerprints. What unsettled me most was not the scale itself, but the calm with which it traveled. Blueprints moved between capitals. Maintenance circulars crossed empires. Technical language migrated intact, as if the same unseen assumptions governed rivers half a world apart. Documentation multiplied. Interpretation shrank. Then the photographs ended. Not tapered, not gradually thinning, they stopped. Albums that once featured towering figures beside pulley towers shifted abruptly to crews of uniform height. Newspapers that had printed wide-angle construction shots replaced them with distant panoramas. Municipal archives continued filing images of bridges and locks, but the operators no longer stood in frame. The machines remained. The bodies did not. The line between those two facts hardened into a date range I could trace almost to the year. Presence on one side, absence on the other. and beyond that dividing point waited something I had not yet approached directly, only circled, only measured, only postponed naming. The next layer of evidence did not arrive in photographs. It surfaced in soil. Municipal repair logs described street levels raised by measured increments. Insurance surveys noted first floors converted into basements without elaboration. Sewer upgrades recorded excavation depths that exposed older masonry far below the expected grade. Engineers recalculated load tolerances for foundations that no longer sat where their builders had originally placed them. None of the documents dramatized what they were doing. They treated burial as maintenance. City councils approved resurfacing projects. Inspectors certified walls that had been partially swallowed by sediment. Planning committees authorized stairwells extended upward, doorways reshaped, windows sealed beneath pavement. The language was procedural, reactive, focused on continuity rather than anomaly. I compared dates. The clusters were difficult to ignore. In port cities, dredging coincided with regrading campaigns. Inland capitals issued drainage studies within the same narrow window. Colonial districts filed nearly identical remediation reports despite different climates, soils, and hydrological histories. Geology could explain some of it, not all. What caught my attention was the alignment. The years in which streets rose were the same years in which oversized clothing orders stopped, the same years in which height columns flattened, the same years in which photographs no longer placed. Towering figures beside pulley towers and gantries. Infrastructure adapted, operators vanished. The two movements shadowed each other too closely to separate without effort. I was not ready to name a cause, only to acknowledge that Earth had shifted, cities had followed, and something else had slipped out of the record at precisely the same moment. By this point, the question was no longer limited to who had operated the machines. It had shifted toward how ceiling-mounted access ports appeared in bridge towers where no maintenance ladders survived. Shafts cut into pylons ended abruptly above modern reach. Gear housings included service apertures placed well beyond ordinary working height, as though adjustment had once been performed from a different bodily vantage. Engineering logic explained part of it. Counterweight systems demanded overhead clearance. Hydraulic regulators required vertical separation. Yet the spatial relationships kept drifting upward, past necessity, past efficiency, into a register that felt designed around a taller form, rather than merely accommodating machinery. I searched for manuals. Instruction sheets existed for lubrication schedules and seasonal inspections. Component diagrams labeled tolerances with obsessive care. Replacement parts were specified down to fractions of an inch. What I did not find were operator training guides. No standardized handbooks. No apprenticeship schematics. No archival curricula describing how these systems were meant to be run in real time. For infrastructure that demanded constant calibration, the absence felt conspicuous. Blueprints survived. Bodies did not. The silence between those two facts grew heavier the longer I held them side by side. If procedures had once been embodied rather than written, carried in physical reach and practiced motion instead of diagrams, then the loss of operators would explain something else I had been circling without naming. Why the machines endured, and why understanding them did not. The possibility hovered, provisional, incomplete, refusing to settle into certainty. Relief at having a mechanism met resistance, at how fragile that mechanism felt. Knowledge replacing metal, memory replacing paperwork, and both receding at the same moment. I did not push the idea further, not yet, but it stayed in view, waiting for whatever came next to either dismantle it or make it harder to dismiss. By the time physical absence became undeniable, documentation had already begun shifting. Census tables from the late 19th century preserved totals with obsessive care, yet individual height columns thinned or vanished between editions. Hospital intake registers survived in fragments. While supplemental pages referencing extreme measurements appeared only once, before being replaced by later summaries that compressed variants into narrower bands. Photographs told a similar story. Early prints showed figures standing beside machinery with proportions that demanded attention. Later reproductions cropped the lower edges of frames. Door lintels disappeared. Gears were truncated at the margin. Captions softened. Where an earlier plate had specified dimensions, a later one substituted occupation alone. No memo announced the changes. No circular explained the revisions. What remained were procedural fingerprints rather than signatures, reclassification stamps, inventory codes overwritten in different hands, ledger columns relabeled to fit new typologies. The mechanisms were mundane, almost boring, which made their cumulative effect harder to ignore. I compared national archives that had never corresponded directly. The same corrections appeared. Scale normalized, margins trimmed, outliers folded inward. Across borders, across languages, across bureaucracies built on different legal systems, the pattern repeated with quiet precision. Not a single actor emerged, only process, committees, standardization boards, archival consolidation offices formed during Reconstruction and industrial expansion. It felt less like an edict than a drift, the slow gravitational pull of classification systems seeking equilibrium. Evidence remained, but its edges blurred, and the more countries I added to the stack, the harder it became to describe coincidence without stretching the word past its usefulness. The question was no longer whether something had changed. It was when and why the change had occurred everywhere at once. What unsettled me most was not the absence of operators, it was the endurance of their work. Steel assemblies still carried loads far beyond what present manuals demanded. Stone pylons resisted erosion in waterways that had swallowed newer construction downstream. Energy efficiencies embedded in 19th century hydraulic systems continued to outperform 20th century retrofits designed to replace them. The timelines did not align. Official histories framed these networks as early industrial achievements, rough prototypes on the road toward modern engineering maturity, yet the materials aged too well. The tolerances felt too precise. Maintenance logs from later decades read less like records of innovation and more like custodial notes written by people inheriting machinery whose logic they no longer fully grasped. Generations appeared only as layers in filing systems. City planners authorized reinforcements without redesigns. Historians credited progress without revisiting origins. The systems remained, quietly governing movement, water, and load distribution beneath streets that had been repaved a dozen times over. I found myself standing inside structures described as obsolete while depending on them daily. Bridges rebuilt around cores, never removed. Foundations absorbed into new buildings rather than excavated. Pavements raised over stonework that no longer appeared on surface maps. It suggested continuity without authorship, survival without lineage. The implication hovered at the edge of articulation. If present infrastructure represented inheritance rather than invention, then modernity itself might be layered over something unfinished rather than born whole. I did not push the thought toward explanation, only toward consequence. What else lay underfoot? What else had been accepted without re-examination? And how many systems surrounding us belonged to a story that had quietly stopped being told? I returned to the first photographs only after everything else had been laid beside them, not to reinterpret them, to see whether they still felt ordinary. Bridge crews posed beside housings that no longer seemed merely large. Counterweights that once looked robust, now registered as excessive. Platforms designed for access rather than display hung higher than necessity alone could justify. Door frames carved into pylons felt taller than safety margins required. Gear teeth sized for torque rather than convenience caught light in ways I had not noticed before. Nothing in the images had changed. Everything around them had sediment layers dated to the same decades, repair records clustered after the same floods, census revisions synchronized across borders, museum labels softened in the same period that photographs stopped showing. bodies scaled to fit the machinery. Training manuals vanished while maintenance logs continued. Archives reorganized just as proportions disappeared from public view. The alignments were quiet. No single document carried the weight, only stacks, columns, margins, gaps that lined up when placed side by side. Institutions absorbed the narrative. Departments replaced people, processes replaced intention, responsibility diffused until only outcome remained. I did not name a cause. I did not claim orchestration. I only placed the materials back in sequence and watched what emerged when they were allowed to speak to one another. Presence, absence, burial, revision, inheritance, silence that behaved less like neglect and more like momentum. The bridges remained. So did the cities built over older foundations. So did the systems we still crossed every day without asking who had first calibrated them or for whom they had originally been built. What else rested beneath pavement? What else had been normalized by repetition? What other measurements had been trimmed to fit expectations? The photographs closed where they began, still, unannotated, waiting, and once seen in this order, refusing to return to what they had been before,